Hi, this is Ken McCarthy of Real Econ TV, and we've got our friend Rob Cohen again. He did a very interesting call not too long ago, interpreting what's going on in the economy and in the markets. And there's a lot more to talk about, so we're going to jump in and cover more material. What we're responding to in particular today is the crash of the markets that took place last week, the week of September 18th, 19th, 20th, all the way to 23. So, Rob, what's on your mind these days as we look at the meltdown of copper, the meltdown of silver, the meltdown of lots and lots of shares?
Well, things are really in a mess now. I think now any economist who is even mildly honest sees that we are definitely going into another recession. I mean, not that we ever left the prior one. And, that just as a side note, we never left the prior recession because if economic statistics were accurate, we would have seen that we never left it.
I hate to stop right there, but that's such an important topic. And this comes up over and over and over again. We hear pundits and government people talking about we might go into a second recession, and then every sane person I know says we never left the first one. Maybe that's a place where we could start talking about why is this the case? Why is it that you have one side basically denying that we ever left the first recession and dreaming that there's even a chance to avoid the so-called second one, and then we have this other group of people, yourself, me, dozens and dozens of other people that we listen to who say, what's this second recession business? We never left the first. What's going on here?
Well, it's a really big discussion, and it has to do with what is the nature of economic science, what are the agendas of those who bring statistics to us. We tend to think that statistics are some dry fact because it's numbers, but they are tremendously manipulated. And I'm just going to say one thing briefly, and then I'm going to want to try to bring this together so that, your listeners have a context in which to understand how this happens. Just to give an idea, just to show how this recession has never left. When George Bush became president back in 2000, he was going into he became president at a very difficult time. We were just going into the dot-com bust. Clinton and Greenspan had really goosed the economy with the pedal to the metal, and now it was time for it to fall back. But when he became president, the number of Americans who were on food stamps were somewhere in the neighborhood of 17.5 million people. Since then, it has basically gone straight up. It has increased at a rate that we've never seen before in the history of the United States. And we can say that because, when the Great Depression happened, there weren't food stamps at the beginning, so we can't show a comparison between them. But in the time since Bush became president, it's gone up from like 17 million to over 45 million, and it has been increasing at an increasing rate.
We've gone from roughly 5% of the country receiving food stamps to, sounds like 15%. These are really rough numbers.
Yeah, it's increased by a factor of 260%.
So if we put this in concrete terms, really rough math, very rough math. But if we're walking down the street and everybody's average, roughly 1 out of 6 people that we see is on food stamps.
I think it's more like, it's between 1 in 7 and 1 in 8, I think.
Oh, okay.
14% of the population. And here's another statistic that just blew me away when I heard it the other day. 1 in 4 children under the age of 6 in the United States lives in poverty.
Wow.
This is the United States.
Yep.
And what country in the world has more people in their country on food stamps than any other country in the world? The United States. Number 2 is the Sudan. Of course, the Sudan has less population than we do, but no country has more people on food stamps than the United States.
Did you say the Sudan?
The Sudan, yes. There is food stamps in the Sudan.
You mean a poor, completely backward nation in a backward, poor continent. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, and 11.7% of all families in the United States are poor, and the threshold for poverty for a family of 5 is under $27,000. So a family of 5 under $27,000, and this $27,000, the threshold for poverty has been created over time. What is the threshold for poverty? It started since around 1964, and that threshold for poverty has been increased by the rate of inflation each year, and the rate of inflation has been gimmicked tremendously. So what the threshold for poverty bought in 1964 is only a fraction of what it buys today. So this number of 11.7% of all families fall under that threshold is a gross understatement. So, the bottom line here is that we have never left recession. The United States, what's really going on is grossly underreported. And the question that I keep on asking myself is why? Is this because of things that are happening in the world? Is this because of things that are beyond our control? Or is this for another reason? And as someone who has always been very interested in economics, I come to the conclusion it has to do with none of these things. It has to do with bad science and the way economics has developed in its utilization. So in order to explain that, I'm going to need to do go over a little bit of history.
Right.
Economics has long been known as the dismal science. It was first called that because Thomas Malthus's dire prediction of mass starvation due to his belief that the population would grow faster than our ability to produce food. And then later it became called the dismal science because of its pitiful track record in regard to both policy and forecasting.
Really? Is that why they call it, the second reason they call it the dismal science?
Oh yeah, practically no one even remembers Malthus. And it was the first time it was called the dismal science was by Thomas Carlyle. And it was strictly because the predictions were so bad. You see, back in the 1800s, up until like the 1870s, every economist was a laissez-faire economist and believed, like the current Tea Partiers, and they all believed that the poor were going to always remain pitifully poor, and there was nothing that you could do about it. Economic science was a science where it was all about what you couldn't do, not about what you could do. It was only later that economists became proactive, and we started to think of economics as a science whereby we could make society better. And it was because of that history that it was originally called a dismal science, because it just predicted horrible things for the poor and for the working person. So it was always, up until then, the history of society was one in which there was the same proportion of the haves and the have-nots, and 90% of the population were have-nots.
And that was considered acceptable and just the way it was, and there was really no reason to do anything about it.
It was considered unchangeable. If you go to Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Malthus, John Stuart Mill, these were the early great economists. All of them said there's nothing that could be done with that. It was only later that people started to question that. And now part of this poverty is because we're returning to the old economics. The Tea Partiers, there's no difference in what they're saying than what was said back in the time of the early laissez-faire economists. This is not anything new. It was rejected because it didn't work. It didn't work then. It hasn't worked during the Reagan or Bush administrations. Not that it's being practiced as, I'll get to and try to explain what's happening here, but policy is creating the mess that we're in.
If I could give a historical footnote that might shed some light on this, during the so-called potato famine in Ireland, and you'll see why I say it's so-called in a minute, there were actually, economists and members of parliament that gave talks on why it was wrong to send relief food to Ireland. that it was, somehow immoral or it played with nature, and so on. And they actually put muscle behind that opinion and turned back relief ships that came from America that had food, relief food on it. They also did things like prevent Irish people from going out to sea and fishing. And I'm not laughing, I'm just at the tragedy of it, I'm just at the absurdity of it, but it's actually what was going on. And the reality was the famine it was true that there was a failure of the potato crop, but there had been a failure of the potato crop everywhere in Europe, and it didn't result in famine everywhere in Europe. It only really resulted in the severe famine in Ireland. And the reason it resulted in the severe famine in Ireland was because most of the Irish people had been taken off their own land holdings and been beggared and put to work on what were essentially plantations. I mean, not like growing cotton or sugarcane, but basically they were very, very, very low-paid agricultural workers. And in order to feed themselves, they depended on their potato crop because they couldn't afford to buy the food that they were raising for the English, who were raising it for export. And the bottom line is, during the entire Irish potato famine, so-called potato famine, there was a vast net export of food out of Ireland because the food was being grown for export by the English landholders who had stolen it from the Irish peasantry. And while doing that, you had a whole philosophy that said, don't help these people, they're shiftless, they're lazy, and we need some real rigor in the economy. So, just a little side note.
Yeah, well, I mean, as we're going to see, there isn't much difference between then and now. I mean, now there's a prettier face put on it, but it's the same thing. And one of the things that has actually shocked me, and I would think that it's hard for me to be shocked at this point in my life, but I have been seeing countless interviews on TV, mostly Fox, but not solely Fox, where they're talking about when there are these natural disasters in the United States, we should not go and rescue people unless we have money to pay for it. So they're going to just let these people go and do nothing and first sit in Congress and argue about how it's going to be funded. That was impossible just a few years ago. A discussion like that could not happen in the U.S. Congress.
Well, for instance, during the post-Katrina U.S. Army Corps of Engineer levee failures, when all those thousands of people were stranded and also held captive in the city, that's a big part of it that was never really reported. They weren't just stranded, they were not allowed to walk out. Americans were horrified that American citizens were suffering in a catastrophe and nobody was helping them. Now, as you point out, that's considered maybe what we should be doing, at least according to certain people, and maybe that should be policy. So when somebody, when there's an earthquake or a blizzard or a tornado or a flood or a levee failure, maybe those people should just be left to die and starve until we can figure out if we have enough money in the bank to help them.
Exactly. And you see, and this type of thing, it just creates outrage in people who see that this is going on. And yet, strangely enough, that outrage just seems to even more disempower them. It doesn't actually come to anything. And what I'm hoping to do is to try to show how this happens and what has to be addressed in order to change things. Because if we just look at all of these outrageous things, there are so many of them. Before you know it, another one happens, and the first one is forgotten, and nothing is done to really get at the underlying cause of it, how this is happening, because it's subtle. The bottom line of what's happening is subtle, so let's see if I can, paint the picture in some way.
Great. One quick thing, and then please go ahead. I just have to point out that in Greece, in Spain, in Ireland, people may not get the entire story, but they get enough of it to get out in the street and make tremendous noise. And it is. I'll just comment on this and we'll go forward. But for some reason in the U.S., people are not catching on to how the system is screwing them. But anyway, let's go forward.
Yeah, I think maybe it's because the United States, the media is more sophisticated at spinning or something. The starvation that's going on in the United States, it's hidden, like those statistics that I gave before. If you would go around in the United States and ask, what percentage of children under the age of 6 do you think live in poverty? I guarantee you that very few would say 25%.